Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on the link between biodiversity and financial stability, respectively instability. I'm very happy that we have this event today, and the event will feature a presentation by the Banque de France, the French central bank. Romain Schwarzmann and several co-authors have produced a wonderful and very worthwhile read, a working paper for the Banque de France called A Silent Spring for the Financial System, Exploring Biodiversity-Related Financial Risks in France. So the plan of today is that we will first hear from Romain Schwarzmann about this paper, the main messages and conclusions of this paper, which is actually a pretty long paper. It's almost a report. It's almost 100 pages. He will summarize that in the first 15 minutes of our event today. And following his presentation, we will hear in a panel discussion about what this all means and debate the findings together with Sylvie Goulard, who is the Deputy Governor of the Banque de France, and with Michael Wilkins, who is a Managing Director at S&P Global Ratings, and has also recently started as an Executive Director at Imperial College London, in the Center for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College Business School. As a way of introduction, let me also mention quickly Romain Schwarzmann holds a PhD in ecological macroeconomics at McGill University, Canada, and works as an economist at the Banque de France, while Sylvie Goulard, I think, is of course well known to many of us here in Brussels and in Europe. She's the Deputy Governor and has held senior policy positions before, including member of the European Parliament, as well as Minister of Defense of France. And last but not least, I already mentioned Michael Wilkins in London. He's based in London and has also distinguished careers with steps at various institutions, including Cambridge Judge Business School and Imperial College Business School. So I think this is going to be a very interesting event, and I think what makes this event really interesting is the topic. The topic is quite a new topic, but I think it is starting to be really mainstream for economists to understand and to start understanding and to start looking into what it means when our biodiversity is actually declining. What does it mean in terms of not just the natural habitat, our environment, but also what does it mean for our economies and ultimately even for financial stability. And the novelty of this report is really that it has gone into a lot of detail, understanding how biodiversity losses in France, in metropolitan France, lead to significant risks to the French financial system, and documenting those various channels in quite some detail. So I very much look forward to the presentation and to the debate. And of course, I also will look forward to taking questions from you, our esteemed audience, towards the end of our panel discussion. You can join the conversation by going on Slido and typing in the code biodiversity, and then you can ask your question and I will see it on my phone and be able to ask them to our speakers. Without much further ado, let me thank you all for joining. And Romain, over to you. The floor is yours for your 15 minutes presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation and opportunity to present today. So we'll start by sharing my screen. And we'll just verify that. Can you see?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. And I will just move ahead and back just to be sure that you can see it. So as you just mentioned, the topic is quite new. So today I would like to spend, perhaps try to summarize, as you say, this very long paper and I may spend a bit more time on the rationale and the methodology than on the results themselves, although I also have some extra slides, I would say, on specific results, but I think it's important to explain why we have done this work. So this presentation will focus on the paper that you can see the title here, that was published as a working Banque de France working paper a few weeks ago by authors who come from 4 French institutions, which are the French Development Agency, AFD, the French Office on Biodiversity, CDC Biodiversity, and the Banque de France. And I should remind that the opinions expressed in the paper and today do not necessarily reflect the views of the Banque de France. And in fact, the Banque de France has not expressed any formal position on the topic of biodiversity. So just some sort of reminder here. So given that the topic is so new, as was discussed, mentioned just a few minutes ago, I think it's important, so new, and I mean by to the financial community and central banking community, I think it's important to start with a brief introduction of what biodiversity and biodiversity loss are about. So broadly, very broadly speaking, biodiversity or biological diversity refers to 3 different components, which are the diversity within species or genetic diversity, the diversity between species, which is really the kind of biodiversity we think about of many different species and so on, and then the diversity that we could call above or beyond species, which is the diversity of ecosystems. And very importantly, biodiversity also refers to all the interrelation, all the interactions between the 3 levels and between the multiple organisms between and within and among the 3 levels of diversity. So if we were to fast forward and very fast forward to why socioeconomic systems should care about biodiversity, we can approach the topic of biodiversity through the concept of natural capital. So basically a stock of capital from which different services called ecosystem services will flow. We usually refer to 3 kinds of ecosystem services, provisioning services. So if you think of a forest, you could think of the wood, the timber coming from this forest. You then have regulation and maintenance services. So again, if you think about this same forest, you could think about the fact that the forest can protect you from floods, or that it can help fighting climate change and so on. And then you have cultural services. And here again, taking the example of the forest, you can think of all the cultural activities, touristic activities, and perhaps even more spiritual relations to this forest. And then these 3 services are underpinned or enabled by basic ecological functions that sometimes people refer to as a fourth ecosystem service, which is the fact, for instance, that nutrient cycling or soil formation will be critical to the maintenance and regeneration of the forest. So now biodiversity loss is now, is now disappearing at unprecedented rates in human history. For instance, the extinction rate of species is currently tens to hundreds times higher than the reference rates of the past million years. And then even within existing species, we see a sharp decrease in genetic diversity. For instance, as you can see on the graph on the right here, wild species represent only about 5% of the total biomass of vertebrates, the rest being composed of either humans or livestock, so basically diversity that is directly controlled by humans. And before we really get to the core of this paper, I think it's important to mention 2 additional points. First, the causes and potential consequences of biodiversity loss are increasingly understood and evident. Here you can see the 5 main drivers. I won't spend too much time on that, but happy to talk a bit more about it later on. So for instance, what we can see here is that, one of the consequences that the IPBES, which is the equivalent for biodiversity to what IPCC is to climate change, the IPBES considers that the risk of pandemics due to biodiversity loss is increasingly high. So that really shows the level of concern that exists among the scientific community on biodiversity loss. However, and this is my second point, it is also clear that it is extremely difficult to assess precisely what the impacts will be. And this is due to the fact that we're facing a lot of complexity, a lot of uncertainty. For instance, one problem we have, if we compare it to climate change, is that we don't have some sort of metric, which is the CO2 equivalent for climate change, through which we can summarize at least a big part of the problem. When it comes to biodiversity, we really need to talk about all these levels of biodiversity, of organisms, and so on. And then we have a lot of non-linearity. We can have irreversible effects, interconnectedness of ecosystems. So we really need to be thinking about this complexity and this non-linear fashion, especially when we cross tipping points. So with all this being said, the question is, why should central banks, or at least why central banks could care about biodiversity loss? And here it's important to remind that as part of their mandate to preserve both financial stability and price stability, central banks have already worked a lot on the question of climate change. And the way they have done that, most importantly, through the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which today is composed of 95 central banks and financial supervisors across the world, it was really by considering that climate change is a source of financial risk, and therefore it falls within the remit of central banks to ensure that the financial system is resilient to this risk. So this means that the most obvious or natural way for central banks to look at biodiversity loss is really through the risk it poses to both financial stability, but also, although this is even more complex, to price stability. And what we can see is that it is with this risk-based approach, basically, that some central banks and other stakeholders actually have started to work very recently, I would say over the past 2 years, on biodiversity-related risk. For instance, I will mention only two important dimensions here. The first one is 2 reports published by the DNB, the Dutch central bank, one in 2019 and the one referred to here, 2020. I will discuss that a bit more. And then there is also an ongoing joint study group between the NGFS and the research network Inspire, which has already published an NGFS occasional paper, which you can see on the right. And we will publish 2 other reports, one which is due this week and the other one for beginning of 2022. So this really leads us to the core of the Banque de France working paper, which strongly builds on the pioneering DNB report I just mentioned. And what we did in this paper was to build on the 2 risk categories identified for climate change. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so to say. So basically, we wanted to focus on both physical risk and transition risk. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the literature on climate-related risk, when we speak of physical risk when it comes to biodiversity, we talk about all the financial losses that could be caused by biodiversity loss. So this could be very acute and global shocks, such as a pandemic, for instance, a much more localized and gradual shocks, such as falls in agricultural outputs, to give just one example. And then we have the transition risk, which refer to the fact that that we could also see economic and financial losses if we have a sudden and very deep or structural economic transformation related to the need to protect biodiversity. So this could, for instance, mean that many assets, many business processes become stranded and could have consequences on the financial institutions exposed to the firms or assets that are stranded. However, as I mentioned earlier, it is extremely difficult to assess the impact of biodiversity loss, or meaning that it is also very difficult to assess precisely or to anticipate which physical risk and which transition risk we will face. So as a result, our study focuses on only one step, which by building on the DNB reports. And this step consists in assessing the dependencies and the impacts of the French financial system on biodiversity. So these estimates can provide a first sense of potential vulnerabilities based on the idea that basically the more one is dependent on ecosystem services, the more it could be exposed to physical shocks. And I say really could is important here. And similarly, we could say that the more one has a negative impact on biodiversity, the more it could be exposed to specific transition shocks. So more precisely, what we do when it comes to dependencies first is that we use a database called Encore, which was developed by the Natural Capital Finance Alliance and the UNEP WCMC. And what Encore does is that it links various business processes to a list of 21 ecosystem services they use for their production. So for a given ecosystem service, basically the production process can have a dependency that goes from very low to very high. Just to give you one example, for instance, if you're looking at the functioning of the production process called large-scale irrigated arable crops, then you will have a very high dependency level on ecosystem services such as water flow maintenance. So that's just one example of how the methodology works. And then based on that, we deduce a dependency level for each firm in the portfolio we will assess on the different production processes they use. And eventually we will have for each firm and for each ecosystem services a dependency score that ranges from 0%, which would correspond to no dependency, to 100%, which would mean that there is a very high dependency. When it comes to the impacts, what we do is that we use a tool called the Global Biodiversity Score, or GBS, which was developed by CDC Biodiversity and Carbon for Finance, and which builds on an existing model called the Globio model. And here, this tool or this model, it uses as input the turnover of the firms decomposed by type of activity and location of activity. So we have a lot of granularity on the firms. And then it transforms basically this data into pressures that each firms create on biodiversity. And it then converts these various pressures into impacts on biodiversity. And all these impacts ultimately, and I think that's the bottom line here, they are converted into a specific metric called the MSA square kilometer. MSA stands for mean species abundance, and I will be happy to perhaps talk more about this indicator if needed, but I think the most important point here is to have in mind that when we say that, there is an impact of 1 MSA square kilometer, that means that it is comparable with the complete loss of 1 kilometer of intact nature. So basically, the higher your MSA square kilometer, the higher your impact on biodiversity. So what we did in the paper, the core of the paper, of the quantitative part of the paper, because there are many parts, is that we gathered data on the securities held by French financial institutions. And here we are talking about equity and debt securities. And we related them to all the firms that issued them. Based on that, we assessed the dependencies and the impacts of these firms' biodiversity through the methodologies I just described. And finally, we attributed part of these dependencies and impacts to the portfolio. And we did that based on the comparing how much French financial institutions were comparing basically the holdings to the enterprise value of the firms in portfolio. So going to the results to keep the presentation as short as possible. And as I said, I think it was important to spend quite some time on the rationale, the methodology. So I will be quite brief on the result, but I'm happy to talk more about that. The main result with regard to dependency first at the bottom of the slide here is that 42% of the value of securities held by French financial institutions comes from issuers that are highly or very highly dependent on one or more ecosystem services. And then on the impact side, which you can see at the top of the figure here, we find that the accumulated biodiversity impact of the portfolio, and this is only on the terrestrial biodiversity, we're not talking about marine biodiversity. So the impact is comparable to the loss of at least 130,000 square kilometer of pristine nature. So it would be, to give you an idea, the equivalent to artificializing about a quarter of the area of metropolitan France. So once we have said all this, what does that mean really? I think that if we want, I wanted to represent our paper in one single graph about what it does and doesn't do. It will be that one. What we did here is that we focus on the green square. We assess only the exposure of the French financial system to this metric of dependencies and of impacts. However, if we really wanted to move further into an actual risk assessment, and really hope that other central banks will join us in doing that, we will need two other critical bricks or blocks. The first one is on the left. We will need to have a scenario of where the danger will struck, where the hazard will hit us. And here, for instance, if I compare to the work on climate change, it has taken a few years, not meaning that we should take that long, but it has taken a few years and a lot of central banks working together on climate-related scenarios. So ideally, this is what we would need on biodiversity as well. Make sure that we work all together on that with experts of the question, of course. And then on the right-hand side, what you see on this vulnerability adaptiveness box is the fact that we would also need to have a dynamic view of how financial institutions, but also the firms in portfolio, could adapt to the specific shock and to the specific exposure. At this stage, we only have static measures, and we really need to move toward these dynamic views of how firms and financial institutions could be vulnerable to the shock we are assessing. So we hope that we will be able to work on that along with other central banks and financial supervisors over the next few months and years. And just to remain as brief as possible, I will stop here for now. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Romain. That was very interesting. I think a clear presentation and a clear exposure of the paper. Let's now move to our discussion and Q&A. And of course, I think we should start from the paper and then extend what it all means. And I think what the paper very nicely shows is that the financial system is exposed to securities issued by non-financial corporations that are in themselves exposed to biodiversity services, ecosystem services. 42% of the value of securities held by French financial institutions come from such issuers, as you pointed out. And conversely, I think you also show that the footprint of economic activity on the biodiversity is actually also quite substantial. A quarter of metropolitan France is directly exposed and affected by the transition shocks that emanate from the non-financial corporations. So we have basically this two-way relation, and I think you show this this mapping quite nicely. Of course, as you also point out, that's not in itself a risk assessment yet, right? Because you don't show what are the shocks, you don't show the likelihood of shocks, and you're not sort of saying all of this is going to become all of a sudden a big shock to the financial system, but it shows the exposure to the shock, to the risk. And so let me then turn to Sylvie. Sylvie, perhaps you want to add.
Now I show myself.
Yeah, we can hear you and see you. So perhaps we can turn to you and hear from you how you assess this work and what it all means for monetary policy and central banking, and where do you see this going really in the next years? I mean, this work stream, which really is quite a new work stream.
First of all, thank you very much, Guntram. Even if I am far away from Brussels, I'm glad to have this debate with you and by Brugge. Now, on the working paper, I want to congratulate Romain, and I appreciate that Brugge took the time to give us the floor, because, as you said, it's a new topic and quite a complex one, and we do not pretend that we have that we have a blueprint. By far, it's not the case. What we try to do, and I will make 3 points. The first one is that I remember when Mark Carney made his famous speech in September 2015 on climate, the topic was not at all familiar to the central bankers and to the world of finance. And I have the feeling we may be more or less in this moment for biodiversity, and we enter the topics as we have to, taking into account our mandate, with the risk for financial stability and prices. But of course, as Romain explained very well, It's quite complex, and the methodology is a proposal. By the way, I pay tribute to the Dutch National Bank because they did a great work before with their paper called Indebted to Nature. There is also a lot of work done in London with the Dasgupta review. So we are just contributing to a debate which is much larger than we are, but we consider it our duty to look at new possible risks and try to evaluate. And if you look at the results of a common workshop between the IPCC and IPBES published in June or July, I don't remember exactly, there is a connection between climate and biodiversity. What the scientists explain is that it would be even a mistake to try to solve the climate issue as if it was something isolated from the rest. My second remark is I had the chance to participate in a commission created by the WHO Europe on health and sustainable development. And what Romain said on the link between biodiversity and health is also something we have to take into account. I say it for the ones who would not be interested so much in animal species or environment. It is also your business because human being can be eventually the target of viruses coming through deforestation and moving from animals to mankind. This is a reason why a reason more to look at it. And my very last point is that there is an initiative, and the launch will take place tomorrow in Paris. It's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. It's a market-led initiative inspired by the famous TCFD, but working on biodiversity and natural capital. And we provide a hub in Paris with the AFD, which is one of the institutions associated in this work of Romain. And we work very closely with British friends and others and international organizations. And it's the beginning of a work trying to figure out what a disclosure of the impact of companies on nature and also the impact of biodiversity loss on the activity of companies. It can seem very abstract, but if you look at agriculture or fisheries, but also on all the industries using water and air, etc., you realize that it is quite important for the economy as a whole. So I stop here. I would be glad to answer your questions if you have more. As Romain said, the Banque de France has not yet an official position on this, but we do our best to work in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. And of course, I cannot resist also mentioning on your second point on the health-related implications of biodiversity loss that I also had a pleasure to participate in a G20-led group on pandemic preparedness and prevention. And one of the results that struck us was that the likelihood of pandemics has been increasing over the last decades and continues to increase, and that this increase in the likelihood that new pandemics occur is very much related to the loss of biodiversity. So this is an exposure not just through production processes, but biodiversity also has a potentially devastating effect on humans directly, and therefore on an important part of our society. I mean, basically on our societies directly, and of course also on our capacity to work and to produce, as we have all experienced and witnessed in this pandemic. So clearly, there's lots of channels. And Sylvie, I do want to come back to you and ask you, after we hear from Michael, a bit more on, how you see this work feeding further into the work of financial authorities in charge of financial stability, such as the ECB and the Banque de France and others. If you can give us a bit more of a sense how you think this is going to evolve this debate, and how quickly the central banking system, that tends to be a conservative crowd, how quickly they will sort of enter the space, and what it then means for financial firms, you know, should we ask financial firms to hold more capital, perhaps even if they are more exposed to these kind of biodiversity risks? I mean, where is this debate going? But I will not ask you that question now. You could just keep it in mind, and I come back to you in a minute. And I do want to hear from Michael Wilkins, who might even also want to answer some of those questions from his perspective, working in London and working closely with financial firms and in the financial firms. I'm sure you also have a view on this. So thank you so much, Michael, and over to you for your remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on this. So thanks for the opportunity, and thanks also to Romain for the excellent paper. I thought it was really interesting. Well done. Yeah, a lot I could say, but I'll try and be as focused as possible. You may know, you may have seen that we published a paper from S&P Global Ratings back in April around this topic, which looked at the issue of natural capital and biodiversity. As Romain said, that biodiversity basically is linked to natural capital and natural ecosystems. And so we were looking at this from the perspective of the economic analysis produced through the Dasgupta review that came out in February this year, which really reinforced the concept of nature being an asset. So the protection of that asset is increasingly important for business, finance, and governments. So the incorporation of natural capital into the assessment of wealth and performance is basically fundamental in addressing biodiversity loss. And there are several targeted actions that corporates and governments can take to address this issue. Primarily, we believe through the reduction of deforestation linked to soft commodities such as soy, beef, and palm oil, mainly within developing countries. What can be done in response to that? And we suggested in our paper back in April a number of things that could be done to try and address this issue. I won't go through them all here, but you can read the paper. There are basically 4 ways that we identified to help mitigate deforestation in the soft commodity supply chain, which we believe is responsible for a very large proportion of biodiversity loss and destruction of the natural habitat. But moving on from that to real issues related to financial impact. So what we're focused in now, more than anything else, is how we translate all this research into supply chain monitoring and ways of trying to identify where nature is being destroyed into a way of making it an incentive on the corporate world and also on governments to arrest or to stop this from happening. So what financial incentives can be applied to actually solve this issue, which I think is the biggest thing that needs to be tackled. One suggestion that we are about to publish on is around identifying what we call the hidden natural capital costs of nature destruction. And in one particular example, which we've focused on, is on the area of natural meat production in Brazil, or basically, production of cattle for beef production. Now, we know that this is a major area of nature destruction, especially related to the Amazon, which contains around 40% of the world's remaining rainforest and 25% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. And the deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon is actually, absolutely devastating. It's 60% of the world's rainforest is in Brazil, and it's being destroyed at an alarming rate, which we believe is close to around 80% of deforestation is actually linked to beef production. And that, in a sense, it shows how much of a concentrated issue this is. Anyway, to cut to the point, how do we actually stop this from happening, or at least reduce the impact? One way we argue is through potential application of natural capital accounting and natural capital pricing to the actual supply chain related issues of beef production in Brazil. So we've done an exercise. We haven't published this yet, so this is a bit of a preview, but we've done an exercise where we look at the cost of beef production for the 3 largest beef producers and have come out with an estimation of the figure of the impact this has in terms of total net revenues, in terms of the linkages to the natural ecosystem. So that destruction of the Amazon through the production of beef because of the deforestation associated with it, amongst other things, those are currently externalities borne by society, but not currently on the company's balance sheets. So that cost of nature, if included in natural capital accounting, would, we believe, have the potential to remediate or try and solve the issue of worsening deforestation in Brazil. And that natural capital accounting methodology, we've actually been liaising with our colleagues and sister company in Trucost to develop this. We've actually looked at data from geospatial sources to be able to estimate the supply chain destruction of the Amazon, and also put a price on that based on the available literature methodologies for assessing the monetary value of the ecosystem services in Brazil. So the bottom line of all this is that we've estimated somewhere in the region of $2 billion in 2019 was the actual cost of the loss of nature due to the supply chain issue related to Brazilian beef processing. If that externality were to be internalized through natural capital accounting methodologies, there would clearly be a strong incentive to stop this deforestation from happening, to basically move supply chain to maybe degraded land or even other forms of trying to arrest biodiversity and natural capital loss. So that is something that we are currently looking into and trying to apply to our analysis of how this actually has a financial impact on companies that we look at S&P Global.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. That was also very interesting, and I think also putting again a strong emphasis on not only the beef production and the Amazon rainforest, but also on what is next. I mean, how do we deal with this issue in the first place? I mean, so far, I mean, the working paper by the Banque de France is very much sort of a mapping exercise, understanding where are the risks and what kind of risks are there. But then the question is, what do we do about it, right? And I mean, I wanted to push Sylvie on sort of the monetary and financial regulatory questions, but perhaps I can also push Romain afterwards on a bit more perhaps less the financial side, but also what you think as an economist, what are the other policy levers we can mobilize. But perhaps we first want to hear from Sylvie on the monetary and financial side.
Thank you very much. And it was very interesting, Michael, what you said, and I could not agree more on the fact that there is an imported deforestation. So we all have a responsibility in our daily life, be it by food or mobility. And it shows that private sector and public sector work very well together on that. And this is one of the very interesting consequences of the magnitude of the challenges we are facing, is that we are reinventing a little bit the way we cooperate. So very appreciate. I will have a look at your paper. I must confess, I did not read it. To you, Guntram, first of all, you will not be surprised that I stress, it is my German side, that in democracies, elected governments are primarily responsible for making policies. It's really more than just to pay lip service to democracy or protect central banks. It is an issue we will have to face. And exactly as it is the case for climate, it requires deep changes which have to do with political choices in our democracy. So I don't develop. What can we do? It does not mean that we cannot take our part. And by providing, first of all, this risk analysis, I really believe that central banks are providing useful tools. I'm not saying the perfect ones or the ultimate ones, but we need to provide new tools to combine the risk analysis of the scientists from a scientific point of view, the people looking at plants or animals, and what we can provide from a financial point of view. And very last point, as you perfectly know, the Eurosystem decided in February the greening of the non-monetary portfolio. We decided at the Banque de France, we were doing it before. We have been doing it since 2018, but in February it was a milestone that all central banks of the Eurosystem decided to join their forces to walk the talk and to green their own portfolio, and not only preach for the private sector, but also see the difficulties. And I'm sharing myself the risk committee of the Banque de France. It is not easy to invest in new industries, startups, funds that are quite new. So we test ourselves what we can do, and in July the ECB and the Eurosystem announced the fact that we are working in the direction of a greening of the monetary policy, which means to include new elements in our macro modeling, to include climate in the collateral policies, to include climate in our stress testings exercise, etc. So we have several tools. And you said that central bankers are a conservative crowd. I could not agree more, but they were meant for that. They were supposed to keep the gold, to keep the prices low, to keep the value of the currency. So I consider that once again, there is a lot of work to do further, but the shift Christine Lagarde brought with her and what we have observed in the last months is quite important. We are not the only ones. Other central banks worldwide working together with us in the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, and we have the Secretariat at the Banque de France, and Romain mentioned papers from them. So a conservative crowd may be paid for that, but also ready to take into account new challenges. And just to conclude, Christine Lagarde was at the opening ceremony of the IUCN Congress in Marseille at the beginning of September, and she once again, it is not a decision of the Governing Council yet, but from a personal point of view, she insisted on the need to measure these risks, to take them into account, to look at them. So maybe in the next developments, we will also have the support of the ECB and the rest of the Eurosystem.
Thank you. Romain, let me turn to you, and I realize that, of course, you're now speaking here, I would say, as an economist and not as a Banque de France staffer in the first place. So I mean, just to get your perspective as an ecological economist, where does your analysis take us in terms of the policy agenda in broad terms? I mean, what are the issues we should be focusing on as policymakers from your point of view?
Thank you. It's a difficult one, so I'll try to. Perhaps I would start from the end and try to explain how I get there. But I would say that, and that's a line of work I would say that I have been working on previously, including through a report I co-author with many others called the Green Swan, where we really try to understand, with regard to climate change, how central banks and supervisors need to act, but in coordination with other players. So basically, we try to avoid a little bit the two schematic and sometimes very oversimplifying views, which are, on the one hand, this is not central banks' job, it's all about carbon pricing, period, and other people who really think that central banks will solve the issue by themselves. So we really try to work on this question of coordination. Obviously, for biodiversity, we're less advanced, but I would say that if I were to take, I would say, a very standard economics hat, I would say, well, it's all about pricing the externality, about internalizing the externality. And here the problem we have is that there's a lot of work on that, and I think the Dasgupta review is incredibly useful for that, really showing that we face major challenges when we want to do that. One of them, obviously, is related to the complexity of all the components of an ecosystem. You could spend your life measuring them. Then you also have issues such as the limited sustainability of natural capital, especially in high-income economies. You could have, like agriculture in the end represents 2% of GDP, 2% of banks' balance sheets. So does it mean that we don't care about agriculture? So that brings a huge methodological challenge. Like without food, you're in trouble, but you don't see that through your standard economic approach. So you need to be like quite inventive there while remaining very, very serious. And Professor Dasgupta has some very useful ideas on that, including about how we need to change our measures of wealth. So that really comes out of the Dasgupta review. There's also the question sometimes of how we could put a very high price on natural capital, sometimes to reflect its limited substability and so on. So once you say that, where do we move next? And I think that Michael's points were incredibly, were very, very interesting. And I really look forward to your forthcoming work actually on that, because this idea of, okay, what are the, from a financial perspective, I would say it's like, what are the assets that we should be looking at? And here it starts like, it doesn't mean that you forget your economist, but you become an economist who work with other disciplines, with other experts. And for instance, we know that at the COP15, the forthcoming COP15, one of the key goals will be to have 30% of land and marine areas to be protected. What does that mean? Which are the areas that should be protected in priority? And that leads us straight away to the question of the Amazon that Michael just mentioned, of course. You could say the same about agricultural transformation, about fisheries, about using less plastics. We know that these are critical areas. So from there, I would say that you could start working from the economic perspective about what are the policies needed, and they change from one to another. You don't have a universal price. That's also very clear in the Dasgupta review, that sometimes you need more quantity-based regulation and so on. But that also makes the links with financial stability assessment, where you could say, okay, what is my mapping of stranded assets there? Which are my the key asset I should be looking at? And this is a line of work that I will be developing with some colleagues over the next few months, and it's probably very aligned. I mean, hopefully very aligned with Michael's work that he has just been describing. Right? You look at a specific supply chain, you try to understand what happens, and then you could mix some sort of quantity restriction, price mechanisms, and so on. So it is less easy than saying the universal solution is A, B, or C. But I think this is really what needs to be done, and it's a mix of different approaches, which brings me back to the initial point. How do we coordinate these different approaches and kind of work on the issue?
Thank you so much. And of course, I can't resist also advertising the Dasgupta report review that we discussed some time ago here at Bruegel with Professor Dasgupta. And I'm sure you can find the event recording also on our website and on our YouTube channel. So we had an in-depth discussion with Professor Dasgupta exactly about his review. So let me get Michael's perspective on the policy side. Michael, you already hinted at a few issues, but one issue that I struggled with when I heard you speak. I mean, you were talking a lot about this natural capital accounting, and you know, I wonder if you want to spend a little bit more time explaining how that would be put in practice and who would do it. I mean, is it about governments mandating firms to do different kinds of accounting? Do you see more the financial supervisors acting here because there is a risk to the financial system? I mean, where do you see this debate, and how would you go about it?
Yeah, no, that's the key point here. And I speak with some degree of experience because I've been a member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures since it was first established off the back of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So back in 2016, the TCFD was established, and the following year, it launched its recommendations for enhancing the disclosure related to climate risks and opportunities. And since TCFD has been established, the implementation rate has soared extraordinary rate, and to the point now where we see many jurisdictions implementing TCFD recommended disclosures on a mandatory basis, and that has had a knock-on effect on how companies report in their financial accounts around their climate-related risks, and that can then, the next part of the chain is that taken into account by the financial community and analysts, including us at S&P Global Ratings, and trying to assess the impact that climate has on credit quality. Now, you can apply the same logic to the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which has only just been launched last week, and S&P Global Ratings is one of the members of that task force as well. So the point, where we're at with the TNFD is several years behind where we are with TCFD, but nonetheless the pathway is very similar, albeit we could accelerate it to some extent given the seriousness of this issue. So integrating natural capital into the national accounting systems is the first thing that we think policymakers could do to help solve this problem. We've already seen it through the UN system of environmental economic accounting. We've seen that that's good to review proposes inclusive wealth as part of the definition of GDP, which includes natural stock as well as the more traditional measures. And we've seen certain countries go down this route already. New Zealand, for example, has done this. So it's not impossible to go down this route of including natural capital into national accounting systems. And we've also seen much more broader multilateral efforts to do this through, we mentioned earlier the UN conference on biological diversity, or COP15, and as Romain said, the aim is to complete the biodiversity recovery by 2050 and protect 30% of the planet's land and oceans by 2030. So we already have these targets. It's a question of how we get there and what methods we use. And that's for the policymakers to decide, obviously. But there are clear tools that can be used, natural capital accounting being probably the most obvious, not necessarily the easiest given the complexities around doing this. But we have technology through geospatial monitoring, which helps us track supply chains. Then we have enough methodologies in place to actually put a price on nature. And now it's just a question of translating that into the right disclosure framework and applying it to the reporting and disclosure regulations, which ultimately come down to supervisors and general policymakers in the financial ecosystem to do this.
Wonderful, thank you. So we are starting to get actually quite a lot of questions, and given that we have only 7 minutes left, let me read out some of those questions and throw them at you. And I think you can a bit pick and choose which ones you want to answer. So the first question by Anonymous is on what on the ground measures can companies take to stop and reverse the loss of biodiversity, and how can they be incentivized to do so? I think, Michael, you went a bit in this direction already explaining your approach, but perhaps we can hear a bit more on that. Catherine is asking, can non-financial corporations be regulated in the way that they have to offset their negative impact on biodiversity? And if yes, how? That I think is also quite a related question. Then there is, I would say, a little bit more philosophical or broader questions by someone called Sophia. She's asking, well, how can the field of economics become more interdisciplinary in order to mitigate biodiversity loss? So that's a very big question. So George is asking, well, apart from the polar cases in the dependency score in Encore, is there a quantitative estimate of the impact on impact of an ecosystem service to a business process? And the last two questions very quickly, and then I think we can go back to our speakers. By Verena Ringler, she's asking, well, what can we do to spread the insights that are really relevant beyond banking and finance to many different players, such as communal or the entrepreneur level? What can we do really to spread this this knowledge? Would that perhaps be something interesting for the EU French presidency to spread that kind of knowledge? And last but not least, a question on which I think is more for Romain specifically. It says that the study incorporates also abiotic elements, groundwater, water, and surface water, that have a huge impact on the results. Figure 12b. Can this bias be corrected? So perhaps you can say also something about the abiotic elements. So I would say sort of three sets of questions. One set of questions, what can we do directly with what can companies do directly to get better at this? Then sort of more broader questions, how can we spread the knowledge? How can economists become more interdisciplinary? And then a few more technical questions on the abiotic structure of the natural system. So perhaps we start with the abiotic very quickly, Romain, to have that being dealt with, and then we go to Sylvie and Michael, please.
Sure, thank you. So on the abiotic, exactly, water provision explains a large part of the dependency score. One thing we did first, the question we asked is whether we should include that as part of biodiversity, and we had some expert as part of the co-authors, and we decided we would. Then what we did is that I didn't present that, but we also assessed the results through all the supply chains. So basically not only your direct dependencies, but the indirect one. And here you see that abiotic factors elements go down, but then you have other dependencies that go up, and you end up with basically all sector being dependent at one stage or another on being dependent on biodiversity. So that kind of addresses your point, but I still think that there's a lot of both theoretical and technical work that we could do on this issue in the future. And then perhaps on question of economics being more interdisciplinary, I think that, well, there's a lot of work, but that's Gupta review, I think, is a critical starting point. I've talked to a lot of central bankers over the past few months who have been quite impacted, influenced by that. So I think that this is really the kind of efforts that could bear fruit in the future. And perhaps also about how firms will be able to disclose. One thing that is important to mention in France is the Article 29 of the Climate and Energy Law, which will require French financial investors to disclose on biodiversity-related risk as of 2022. So that also will contribute a lot to developing new, probably new indicators, framework, and so on. I'll stop here so that the other speaker have time to talk as well.
Thank you, Sylvie. Perhaps to you on the French presidency, I think you will be keen to answer that question, I'm sure, and perhaps you want to say also something about economists.
Well, very briefly, because Romain was excellent. I begin with this interdisciplinary element. What I've experienced, and actually you were yourself in such a panel for the G20, Guntram, on health. What I've experienced, it is very fruitful to put people with very different perspectives together, and that they learn to speak a common language, that they listen to each other. We work much too much in silos. And for example, the One Health concept developed by the WHO and the World Food Organization is that health is one for human, animal, environment, and all these vision, Sophia, is very important. So do not hesitate to push the barriers of the disciplines and to go for cross-fertilization. And I don't come back, but Romain was perfect on disclosure. It is also a way to increase to spread the insight and all the work done by the TCFD and TNFD. On the French presidency, it's not my responsibility. What I can say is that the President Macron organized in January a summit called the One Planet Summit on Biodiversity. You can find many interventions on with several initiatives, Présode for zoonotic disease, or La Grande Muraille Verte in Sahel region with the former president of Mali, Ifoussou, etc. So there is a lot that has been already achieved, and of course a lot to do. So I'm quite sure it will be among the French priorities, but no one can do it alone. It's not a French problem. It's not a European issue. It is something that has also a difference with climate, is it that it is much more to consider at regional level for coral reefs or mangroves or some forests or coastal regions, etc. You cannot look at biodiversity in general, and all the targets Michael recalled, 30% of protection, it is fine, but we also have to keep in mind that biodiversity is diversity and it has to take place everywhere in the world. So I stop here, but really thank you so much. It was a very interesting debate, and I hope for the ones who listen to us, and do not hesitate to spread. Maybe Romain, tomorrow we will publish a shorter version of your paper, more accessible in the so-called bulletin of the Banque de France for the ones who would like to spread it to local governments, NGOs, or whomever. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michael, the last word to you. What can firms do? Perhaps that's the question for you.
Thank you. I'll be brief. So I think that the key thing is really around supply chain management. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing, in the Amazon destruction linked to Brazilian beef producers and their supply chains, and there's progress being made there, but there could be a lot more progress. More and more companies are applying their own biodiversity policies, but there's also a pull as well as a push. So in Southeast Asia, in our report, we highlight how deforestation in palm oil supply chains is being handled, both from the fact that palm oil refineries and off-takers that go use the product for consumer good companies, and banks' financing of palm oil concessions have been targeted, and that's starting to have an impact. There are various certification schemes out there for palm oil, and no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation, and that's actually leading to a reduction in the deforestation of palm oil linked natural habitat. So we are seeing some success already through supply chain monitoring, through companies' actions and policies, but increasingly through consumer demand that these actions are taken into account. And that's really the way forward. So that combination of policy, company action, and also consumer pressure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of you for being here with us and for discussing this very important topic. I'm sure it's not going to be the last event that we at Bruegel will organize on the topic of biodiversity and what it means for our economy. And I really want to insist that I think this has become really a very, very important new area of work because economists finally have started to realize that the natural habitat, the biodiversity, the climate are actually absolutely central. They are the basis for human society, and we have to address this problem, and that can only be done by openness to other disciplines on the side of economists. And I think we at Bruegel, we certainly want to contribute to that debate in a constructive and open-minded way, working with scientists, working with other researchers. So it was really great to hear from you about this report and how you interpret and what it all implies, this report and what it all implies for financial stability, banking, but also the economy more largely. Thank you so much to our audience for asking so many questions. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.